Hey guys, John Libinati here with glutenfreeworks.com. I don't know if you saw it, but about a month ago there was a meme going around Facebook, and it's this one of a delicious looking cheeseburger. And what the meme says is, "I'll never understand 5,000 years of eating bread, and suddenly in the course of a decade, everyone is allergic to gluten." Alright? Now, I saw people posting this on Facebook and they're ranting about it. Some people were saying it's really funny. So depending on, how you felt, you either thought it was funny or you thought it was, busting on people that have gluten allergies or sensitivities or celiac disease. But when I saw it, I thought, well, maybe we could take this as an opportunity to teach people. Because who knows? I mean, are people all of a sudden allergic to gluten? Are they all of a sudden sensitive to gluten, or is this something that's been going on for a long time? So what we have here is Impact. It's the newsletter from the University of Chicago Celiac Disease Center. This gentleman here is Dr. Stefano Guandolini. He is the director of the Celiac Disease Center, and he put together this brief history of celiac disease in 2007, but it's just as relevant today, 10 years later. So let's take a look here and see like what happened. Why are people reacting to gluten, and how long has it been going on? As Dr. Guandolini points out, the human gut developed over 2 million years, and in most of that time, it was people hunting nuts and fruits and animals. I mean, we had things like let's take a look here. Mammoth hunts, I mean, people were chasing down these giant animals. I guess they didn't wear clothes back then. In any case, this guy's having a bad hunt. But, people had to hunt for their food. They had to chase it down. They had to find it. And at some point, someone got smart and said, you know what, we can do this a better way. And then in the Neolithic period, that was about, I think, 17,000 years ago. Yeah, 17,000 years ago it started. They started growing crops, and they started domesticating animals. Here's the guy's little wolf dog. They've got a pig over here. I don't know what these things are back there. And then you've got the little kid, and he's cutting. It looks like wheat here. He's cutting with a, I don't know, a jawbone. It's supposed to be a scythe or something. And then here you have the lady. She's grinding down the grains. And then here you have the little kid, and he's developing celiac disease. Because what happened, according to Dr. Guandolini, is because people started developing problems, food intolerances, because all of a sudden they're eating food with antigens. Those are things that can cause a reaction that they weren't known to. The gut wasn't used to it. It had 2 million years to develop. It had never eaten any of this stuff before, but now all of a sudden it was eating different things. Most people could adapt, some people couldn't, and the people that couldn't developed the food intolerances. So some 8,000 years after its onset, celiac disease was identified and named, and this was by a doctor, a Greek doctor called Aretaeus of Cappadocia. Alright, so Aretaeus of Cappadocia, he wrote Materia Medica, one of the first encyclopedias of medicine, and what he described celiac disease, he called it the disease of the abdomen. He actually called it coliacos, which is the abdomen, and he called it the celiac affection. So 17 centuries go by, and in the early 19th century, there's a Dr. Matthew Bailey published his observations of a chronic diarrheal, that's a diarrhea disorder in adults causing malnutrition and characterized by a distended abdomen. He even went on to suggest dietetic treatment, so he's saying that people do better on a diet entirely of rice. And if you know anybody who's done an elimination diet, rice is the main thing people use because people don't really react too much to it, most people. Later on, Samuel G., about 75 years later, he was very famous already, so he was already a leading authority on pediatric diseases. He described celiac disease, and he got the credit for it. And he said if the patient can be cured at all, it must be by means of diet. So people started developing problems thousands of years ago. Almost 2,000 years ago, it was described by a doctor, Aretaeus of Cappadocia, and then it wasn't until the 19th century that this was actually put into medical texts and taken, I guess, seriously. Now after that, it wasn't until the 80s that tests came along, and that was the endoscopy with a biopsy, where they could take a look at the villi in the intestine and say, hey, there's something wrong here, there's villous atrophy. And then after that, it wasn't until the 90s that tests came along that could test for blood, and even then, I mean, that wasn't widely known. Even now, it's not widely known. So it's taken a long time for this to trickle down, but it was known thousands of years ago. At least one guy knew that people would be sickened by these grains. Now let's take a look at a study done by Dr. Joseph Murray at the Mayo Clinic, where they tested blood that was taken from in the 1950s from people at an Air Force base, and it was I guess frozen, or it was kept there. They took that blood and they tested it for celiac disease, and they compared that to modern people. So I'm going to have to put my headphones on to hear this. Excuse me.
Celiac disease was thought to be a very rare condition, and we had the opportunity to study blood samples which were saved about 1950, so over 50 years ago. And we could use some now sensitive blood tests to identify the people in that group of samples, to see how many of them had celiac disease, and then to follow them up over 45 years to see what happened to those who were positive for celiac disease. Now, of course, these patients never knew they had celiac disease. It was a rare diagnosis. Even in the 1950s, when these samples were saved, and the subsequent decades, it was not until the 1990s that people started to appreciate that maybe celiac disease was not as rare as we once thought. Anyway,
so what he's saying is that these blood samples were taken in the 1950s, but none of these people were diagnosed with celiac disease. There wasn't a blood test back then, so these people just went their lives probably never knowing that celiac disease was affecting them.
By testing these old samples, we found that celiac disease really was pretty rare. About 1 in 700 samples were positive for celiac disease. And that was much lower than when we tested people of the same age now. So young people now are much more likely to have celiac disease. It's 1 in 100.
So what they found was that from the 1950s until now, or more recent, that something happened. We went from 1 in 700 people, which is pretty rare. It's almost like what the meme was saying. The last 5,000 years, you never heard about it. What happened in the last 10 years that everybody's allergic to gluten? Well, Dr. Murray's study here, when they tested 1950s blood, people from the 1950s, 1 in 700 had it. Now 5 times more people have it. So what happened?
We also looked at people who shared the same years of birth as the people we had tested, or we had samples from 1950. So people born in about 1930. And their current rate of celiac disease was also quite high. Not quite 1%, but not much under 1%. Much higher than people with the same birth years had back in 1950. So it seems that celiac disease has become at least 5 times as common now as it was 50 years ago. And obviously human genes haven't changed, but something has changed in our environment to make this disease more common.
So, celiac disease is more common than it was even 50 years ago. Okay, so what Dr. Murray found in this study, and this was of thousands of blood samples, is that people now are 5 times more likely to have celiac disease than they were in the 1950s. And that is extraordinary. And that is not just because more people are being diagnosed or more people are being tested. This is actually people now have celiac disease in much greater prevalence levels than they did back then. So we know that people now have celiac disease in a much higher prevalence, but why? Why is it grown like this? Why does the person say in the meme, why do people have it in the last 10 years? You know, all of a sudden everybody's allergic to gluten. Well, I'm going to give you 4 reasons, okay? The first one is that wheat was never a staple of the diet, the Western diet. It was corn up until the 60s into the 70s, and then it transferred over to wheat. Second, wheat has been hybridized over the decades to have more and more and more gluten, because gluten is so usable in making pastries and cakes and breads and condiments and everything else. So you have something now it's almost ubiquitous. The first one, it's just eaten so much more. The second one is that it's been hybridized to contain more gluten, which makes it tougher and tougher to digest, and then those undigested fragments cause inflammatory responses, whether celiac disease or whether it penetrates the lining of the small intestine and causes problems in the brain or other organs. The third thing is that the tests are available. They're blood tests, and these blood tests have only been around for 15 years or so, so they're relatively new as well. And the last thing, the fourth thing, is the internet. Communication among people who have this is so much greater than it ever was. We have things like Facebook, we have things like Twitter, where someone can get a diagnosis and then tell all of their friends, tell all of their family, hey, I have this. And it's not something that you hear at a family reunion, it's instantaneous. Okay, and you can reach tens of people, hundreds of people, millions of people. You know, one celebrity says that they're on a gluten-free diet because they're sick. Millions of people become interested in it. So these are the 4 main points. I would say that wheat is now ubiquitous. It's in almost every processed food. It's in things that you would never even think it would be in, as well as barley, rye, and oats. It's been hybridized to contain more gluten, which makes it harder to digest, and it's those undigested fragments that penetrate the lining of the small intestine, causing all these problems. The third thing is testing, that more doctors are testing for it. The tests are actually available, commercially available, so then you're finding more people, whereas before they just slipped through the cracks. So many of these symptoms that present were treated, and actually kind of still are treated, as if they were the disease state, when it was this underlying problem from gluten. And the last thing is just greater communication in the internet. So those are the 4 reasons why, after 5,000 years, all of a sudden it seems in the last 10 years, everybody's allergic to gluten. I think in the next 30, 50 years, it will just be common. Maybe everybody will be tested for it, and then we're going to find that it's been affecting people a lot more than they thought. I'm John with glutenfreeworks.com. I hope this has helped you. Thank you for subscribing. I'll talk to you again soon.